Hey everyone, John Henry here, Slingshot Futures Trading Group. Thanks for joining me in today's video. Before we start, take a second to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and make sure to click the notification bell icon so you don't miss our next live stream right here on YouTube every afternoon at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Also, don't forget your free morning brief that's waiting for you over at ssftg.com/brief. That way you can be sure you're loaded up with the major levels of interest for the day, as well as, of course, some morning charts to get you going on the right foot. Are you looking to get filled in ahead of time with a video-based game plan every morning, every week, every month? Then take a look at the join button right below the video to gain access to our SSFTG briefing and live analysis rooms during the morning session. Today's topic is going to be to range fade or not to range fade. And really the big question that we come into on a day like today is what happened yesterday. Obviously, we always want to know what happened yesterday. But also, how is the day starting off, right? One of the biggest things that we always want to look for is where is the market opening up? Because typically when the market is first opening up, especially at the open, it's looking for an objective. It's looking for something to kick it off. And if we're opening in the middle of nowhere, well, then it's got to hunt for an objective. And if it's opening on top of an objective already, then it might be a clue that it might start reversing or going the other direction. So just where it opens in comparison to where yesterday's price action took place can give us a really big clue. And if we look at what happened the day before, it was a very strong move down at the open and then became a V bottom that went screaming all the way back to the upside, and that led into an attempt at a spike in channel that broke down and tried closing the day back up, but they closed right back on that area of potential resistance, right? Previous swing low is support, now breaks down is resistance. Well, that's where we're opening up. And if we look at today's price action so far, it opened up with barely any gap to the downside. Get it? Yeah, bad joke there. It opened up with a very small gap to the downside, barely to the downside. And realistically, when we're starting off without much of a gap, it's kind of a wait and see. You know, are we going to keep going to the downside? There was a lot of wicks. Maybe there was some resistance up here. Obviously, there was resistance with the previous swing low. Is the market going to push down and respect this area? It's kind of waiting to see how things are going to respond. Zooming out and looking at the bigger picture, it's not really opening anywhere. We're still inside the previous day and there's barely any gap. So there's not really any new information or context that the market's giving us. So we've just got to kind of wait a little bit. And moving over to bar 2 of the day, it pushes right back up, and now we're kind of back at settlement price. It's back at the gap. Nothing's really happening, right? It's an inside candle, meaning that it's completely inside of the first candle of the day. It hasn't broken higher, hasn't broken lower. It's not really doing anything. It's a bull bar, but that doesn't really prove anything either. And given that we're opening up right on top of that previous resistance and the sellers aren't following through, this move up being an inside bull bar, if the buyers can find some follow through, might be able to get that push back up to test right around where the obvious range resistance is at the top, around that 36.16, 36.17 plus area. Now, where it is at the moment, it looks as though they're trying to hold down the bottom side of that range, right? They break out, pull back, looking for continuation. But if that fails and the market starts getting back inside of this, then there's a very good likelihood that buyers are going to look to try to roll back in. So far, it's just an inside bull bar. There's not a whole lot of conviction one way or another, and we're starting off as a range with it closing right on top of the gap. That's a tough one. Buyers may come in above it. Sellers might just as well come in below it. The probability is about 50-50 either way here, so it's mostly just kind of a waiting game or taking either edge of the sword. The bulls get the breakout move to the upside, and it's a really strong bull bar. And we're seeing increasing prices with increasing volume, which would suggest that buyers are taking profit. We're seeing profit taking coming into the highs, and not only just the highs, but also back to that previous level of resistance. We have a previous swing low that very quickly became resistance, and now it's trying to hold the market down. This is still a really strong bull bar to the upside, But given the context of what's going on here, we're starting to get back to the high of the range. We're getting back into these zones of interest that are going to begin putting pressure back to the downside. And sellers might very well look to try to push this back lower depending on how things kind of go around this zone. We can also highlight that range that was earlier and kind of see what's going on. But really, as it stands, if bulls are going to follow up with another big bull bar, we're probably going to break above the highs, which would be at around 14 quarter, 14 half. And if they can continue that, then it's probably just going to rush straight up towards the 19s and 20s. If the buyers fail that continuation and start pulling back, there might be some initial buyers looking to buy back on the retest of the high of bar 2. Those would be the re-entry buyers at 36.10 half. Otherwise, there might just be sellers looking to fade the high of the range coming off of this resistance. So we've got to see what the follow-through is. We have a big jump up. Cool, but what's the market going to do next? What's it doing with this information? Didn't do a whole lot. It was a total failure. Bulls wanted to see a big bull bar to the upside. That would have got that continuation all the way up to the 18s plus. They didn't get it. Totally fell on its face, rolled right back over, and now we have an inside bear bar. Well, we just saw what happened on the inside bull bar, and yes, that is creating a little bit of a gap. We've got the candle gap high and the low, but remember, the inside bar, really, the gap itself would be here, and the signal bar is always the extreme. Well, the one that actually triggered that would have been this. None of these inside bars really count for much. So as far as gapping goes, sure, there might be gaps there, but it's nothing that I'm really going to worry too much about, and that's a really heavy bear bar. We're cycling off of that earlier resistance at 36.1225. We're seeing downward movement, but the lowest volume the day is seen, well, all day. Not to sound too redundant, but given that momentum and where we are and what we're seeing contextually, it would make sense to see sellers at least give it a shot. You'd expect to see sellers come in below 1150 to try to get back towards 975, back to the gap, and then maybe back towards the base of where these bulls kicked off at 775. If we look back to yesterday, there are also a very obvious gigantic chunk of wicks down here back at 3602 to 3600. And so that zone, depending on how long it takes the market to get down there, if it can get down there, if it ever moves down there, that's going to be the next big zone of interest. So right now, the sellers have kind of a pretty wide open door. It's short term initially, but then if it really wants to break down, there's some room. And we could see them pulling all the way back down to start filling in some of those wicks back in the low 3605s and lower. Wow, we get a gigantic bear bar to the downside, and obviously with this humongous bear bar, we see volume increasing. What a shock, right? I would have never thought. That's likely a lot of sellers who sold the highs taking profit. That's probably buyers getting stopped out underneath the low. New shorts coming in below the lows, which, given that this is a range, is probably a horrible place to come in. And overall, there's just a ton of volume hitting down here. And it makes sense. We're coming back to backfill a lot of that 3606 area, starting to get into the 3605s. This is where a lot of people are waiting. So seeing the volume come up here kind of makes sense. There is an inside bar, and even to the low of the bull bar, depending on where the next candle closes, we might still have some candle gapping. So that's a very strong bear breakout that's at least going to be demanding an attempt to try to retest the lows. We'll see if they can actually succeed, or if they want to keep this going down, or what they want to do. And we get a bull bounce right back up. Now that does, again, that creates that window. We've got the signal bar here down to here, and that gives us our zone of interest to give us a clue of some candle gapping objectives lower. So candle gap traders are going to be looking from there to the top of that, and we can go 1-to-1 initially, and they're going to be looking for objectives right back down to 3600 quarter. Man, talk about just a mess of objectives down there that people are going to be looking into. Now, there is a little bit of a concern. We have a bull bounce back to the upside, but we're not seeing sellers defend. Volume's actually lower, and that could potentially be a little bit of a problem. Sellers want to push this down for that next leg lower. Why aren't they showing up to the party, especially when they're closing out a really strong bull bar like this on lower volume? It's seeming like the sellers have possibly gotten out at the range lows and just cut it out, right? Now they're not looking to stay in anymore. There might even be longs who look to buy into that just to see if it can push back up towards, guess where, 3609.75. When it's hovering around the settlement usually has a gravity to it and it kind of sucks price back to it. So longs will be looking for a push back up. They got the push back up, and that completely fills in the gap too. So all of those downside objectives that were there from the gap perspective, those are gone. There may still be some sellers who are below that inside bear bar, and because it worked out so well, there may even be some residual sellers who are waiting there trying to push it back lower too. So if it can start pushing back up towards that 3611 quarter, 3611 area where the sellers got short underneath the bear bar, you might find some sellers trying to press that back down to come back in, right? They got the initial short, it worked out super fast, they get their targets on the flush, now it's back. Well, hey, this just adds more context. Now we've got a lower high and a possible turning point. Why not sell a little bit more? So there will be some shorts who look to sell back into this and push it back down. Another kind of counter argument, talking, devil's advocate, playing both sides here. We're seeing a really strong bull bar up and even less volume. That's not great. That's a little bit of a concern. If we want sellers to be coming in, we should be seeing the volume coming up, not going down. Going down is showing that nobody's interested in selling, which means buyers are still in really, really strong control. Better to sit on the sidelines and wait until we can at least see something, right? This is a little bit too much bullishness. Get a very strong bear bar down. Now, this is kind of interesting because we have a very strong bear rejection, but the volume is the second lowest it's been all day. This is a really big bear bar, so obviously a lot of movement happened, but it didn't take a whole lot of volume to get that done. Now, that could mean that there's just excess volatility, like within a range. That's what you expect to see. That could also be a case of larger positioning going on for a bigger move. We don't know yet. It's still kind of in a range up and down. It kind of looks like a lightning bolt. But that is at least a clue to potentially use going into the end of the day that might at least kind of clue us in on where the market wants to go going in towards the afternoon session, going into tomorrow, because the daily right now is very interesting. And kind of getting that gauge of what's happening, there's no interest. This move down doesn't appear to be getting bought. So that's not a great thing for longs who are looking to come back in, especially considering that they're pulling back to the break-even point of the long bull bar at the bottom. 3607 quarter, they went right down to it. So we got to see a little bit more here. Nobody's stepping up to the plate. We get a bull bar back up, and it goes right back up towards, what a shock, back to settlement, 3609.75. And it closes really weak. Now, initially, this would make me think, wow, that's probably pretty bearish, right? That's a really weak bull bar. It's rejecting off of settlement. This is an obvious area where there's a lot of resistance, so it makes sense to see sellers want to try to push this down. But now we have another super low volume day. Now, this one is the second lowest volume. It's an inside bar, so at least that kind of fits the low volume. But at the same time, seeing that big wick at the top, obviously a lot of volume took place. Well, otherwise there wouldn't be that big wick. But, well, we're just not seeing it, right? So again, a little bit of volume, but a lot of volatility. That's showing that there's some movement going on behind the scenes, some jostling for position, if you will. Not necessarily trusting up or down. Right now, it doesn't seem like buyers are interested in buying any dips, and it doesn't look like sellers are really interested either. I think we just need a little bit more. Now we get a big bear bar to the downside. Nice, healthy looking bear bar down too, and that's breaking beyond the inside bar. We're also seeing volume increasing. That could be a couple things. That could be sellers underneath the bull bar looking for an inside bar breakout. It's a very common setup. It could also be buyers coming into this big move down, right? Now, that would normally be my first inclination, but there's no wicks, or, well, the wick that is there is so tiny that it really doesn't give a whole lot of information. So, yeah, there's a wick at the bottom, and sure, maybe they failed a little bit, but aside from the fact that they're bouncing off of the earlier entry point of the long above that bull bar and not really closing beyond it, we're seeing volume increasing as it's coming into this. It seems like buyers are trying to buy the dip, but they're just not taking it very far up. And scratch that, we get a gigantic move to the upside. And this one is just, it's got a different feel to it. It rips right through the settlement price, and the settlement's about halfway through the candle. That's your stereotypical perfect breakout. And usually when you have that kind of breakout, the market loves coming back to retest those zones a little bit later on. So seeing the market pulling back towards this area might be something to watch a bit later. Well, let me draw it for whatever reason, but something a little bit later over here back at, again, what a surprise, at 975. But that's the breakout point that it's really shoving its head above. And if they can get some follow through, some continuation, then we would also be breaking back into the bottom of that previous consolidation that it broke out of. And then it would be a failure, right? They're trying to go lower. They have another move down and then it fails. That's a big problem, because if it starts migrating back up, the next time it comes down, it's more likely going to be sellers looking to exit at break even. They've been underwater the whole time, which means that when it comes down there, we're probably going to get that big bounce up. Everything is starting to shift a little bit more towards the bullish side now, especially with this big bull bar. Will buyers want to buy way the heck up here given that it's a range day? Probably not. It would make a lot more sense that they try to buy a pullback, buy back to, settlement, buy the previous bear bar's high, even buy the previous bull bar's high. Just something that's back a little bit so you've got some room. Nobody really wants to buy at the top, especially knowing that if it is going to go higher, it's probably going to go up towards the high closes as an objective, and that's at 36.13. Got to make sure you've got room inside there too. Did it go exactly there? Yeah, exactly to 36.13 with a bull bar, and that's good, right? We're seeing some good bullish follow through, but we're seeing higher prices with now the lowest volume the market has seen the entire day. That's not good. We just saw a huge bull commitment step up to the plate, and now all of a sudden nobody's interested. That might mean buyers are in, and they're just waiting. They're hanging on. They're waiting for higher prices, and they're not selling out. So that could be a very good sign. It depends on how the market responds. But we're also seeing a lot of wick back and forth. So there was some volatility on this, a lot of back and forth movement. And it was on very, very little volume. It's the lowest volume the entire day. So there's something going on here that might be a little bit more concerning than the market's necessarily leading to believe. And knowing that we're coming into resistance, we're back to the range lows, just a couple more ticks above, and now we've got the high closes. Everything's starting to stack up as though, if we start seeing some volume coming in at the top, we might end up being, kind of getting into a short-term top, going a little more range-bound. Okay, well, we get a bear bar back down. Doesn't make any new progress up or down. It is an inside bar. But if we look at the volume, it's stepping up a little bit. That's a good sign for buyers. That means that the move down is getting bought into. But, well, it's closing strong. That doesn't help the buyers, right? When it's closing down like that, it's not demonstrating weakness. That's demonstrating control. You don't close a candle like a brick unless you are in control of it, right? At least in the short term. So buying against that kind of candle, yikes, that's really, really tough to do. Not many traders are going to want to do that. And knowing that it is going down, we're seeing very little volume coming in. So it's pretty obvious that buyers aren't convinced yet. Yeah, they're kind of, picking away at it a little bit, but it's just not quite there yet. Now we've got the pullback. See the difference? Huge wick on the bottom. It is a bear bar, and it's following through. Where did it go back to? 3609.75. What did we see? Lower prices, big jump in volume. Now volume's back up to where it was before, and that's when prices dipped down. What is that telling us? Buyers are buying the dip. They're BTFDing. They're looking for the rally to the upside. There are a few things that might stand out, like rising support, something along those lines. That's lining up pretty nicely. It could be a wedge breakout pullback. It could be any number of things. But they're all lining up right around that same point in the obvious zone of interest, the settlement, right in the middle of it. And seeing this really, really weak bear bar and huge volume coming in, knowing that that was likely, in this context, bullish volume, there's going to be a lot of buyers that buy the close of that bear bar and say, hey, you know what? Good enough. I'm going to look for a continuation. They'll buy the close of it. They'll buy a tick above it. They'll look for a breakout, etc. Because the objective to the upside now, if it does go higher, is a new high. We just cycled off the lows, and all of the volume context that the market has given us so far is telling us up. Well, if every time we go up, we don't get any volume, every time it pulls back, we get a lot of volume, buyers are buying in, but they're not taking profit yet, or we're seeing very little profit being taken. It's mostly all buying. Every time it dips, the volume goes nuts. When it goes higher, all off the gas pedal. Nobody's interested in getting out of the positions yet. And that adds a huge amount of context to the longs on the underlying, kind of under the surface a little bit. We get a really nice bull continuation to the upside, and notice the volume again. One of the lowest, if not the lowest volume of the entire day. Really strong bull bar, really nice context for upside continuation, and there's not a soul selling it. That's a great sign for buyers to keep this going to the upside. We get another big bull rally to the upside and a huge bull bar. That candle closing right on its highs. Very, very good sign that we're trying to get some continuation. There's no candle gapping, but very likely shorts, if they tried coming in, got stuck, right? They shorted underneath the second sell. It was off the range highs. If they're scalpers, they got their scalps. I believe that was enough for a scalp. But if they didn't go for, if they went for anything more than a scalp, then they're stuck. And if they're stuck, well, that's probably going to add some fuel to the fire to the upside. So bulls are sitting really, really good right here. Now we're starting to get a doji. Okay, volume is sort of stagnating. We're not seeing some profit taking yet necessarily, but at the same time, it only went one tick above the highs. And whenever I see a new one tick high like that, that's always a little bit of a concern. It's not so bad because it closed as a doji, but I would still expect to see it pull back a little bit. If it does pull back, what'll be interesting is to see, are buyers buying it, or is nobody buying it, or what are they doing with a pullback? Are they holding the aggressive channel? Is it a little bit wider? This will give us a lot of information depending on if it goes up or down. And they pull back and they closed right on top of 36.1225. I got to delete these lines just so I can see this. All right, so it closed right on top of 36.1225, and we have a bear bar down, but now there's no volume. Nobody's really buying it here, which is a bit of a concern. If it is going to go back up, we're not seeing the buyers coming in on the pullback anymore. Which means that if it goes back up, guess who's going to be jumping out of the trade? Everybody who was buying into the move up, they were counting on that breakout move to the upside, and so far, it hasn't happened, and now we're not seeing anybody backing them up anymore, right? So they've been defending, they've been buying, they've been getting everything going, but now when it comes time to go, nobody's there, right? Nobody's showing up to the party. So that's not a good sign for buyers, and we're probably going to see a lot more profit taking than we normally otherwise would have if it gets back up to the highs, especially since it only made a one tick high. If it starts pulling back, there might be some buyers in it, sure, but realistically, I think a lot of traders are going to be looking to get that move going back up. If it starts breaking underneath this rising support, then we run into a whole other host of problems, and there's just too many issues then. So it's got to go now, or probably going to start falling on its face. And we get a nice bull bar to the upside, really, really good continuation, and very interesting, no volume. Right? Big bull bar, standing tall, right on the highs, breaking above the top, everything, all above all of them, right? Punching my mic, that's how excited I am. And nothing, right? Nobody's selling it. Well, if you're a buyer, that's fantastic. And if you're a seller, that's a really big problem because now you're stuck and nobody is helping. So we've got a really interesting spot here. This might end up becoming a squeeze. Now we get a big bear bar rejection, and we see volume increasing. Some profit taking coming off the table. Not as much follow through anymore. So buyers are kind of thinking, well, all right, it held the channel lows, but now it's just kind of getting stuck, and now it's going into 11 o'clock, and then it starts going into lunchtime, and then you can see everyone just sort of gave up until, oh no, they almost got it back up after lunch. Oh no, they did. They just straight up gave up all the way down to the lows. Now we're starting to see a lot of profit taking. So very interesting how when we're in a range, it can become sort of problematic looking at a range through really wide scope. And what I mean by that is zooming way out here, it's really easy to look at this and get lost in the overall trend and say, yeah, this thing's going straight up. But remember, we're not trading out here. This is a 5-minute chart. I'm not trading an hourly, right? We're zoomed in under the microscope. So it's cool that it's going up in the bigger picture, but don't necessarily, get too caught up in it either to where you're not trading these things appropriately. Because today we started off with the context, all the context in the world to believe that it was going to be a range, and fading the range is the natural thing to do in those circumstances. Even right now, we're seeing this big push to the downside, and realistically, this might come with a little bit more oomph because we still have this open gap and we've got some lower highs, but there are going to be a lot of traders who are looking to execute down here, right? That could be execute as sellers taking profit. It could be new buyers coming in, but we're seeing it in the volume. The volume is reflecting a huge amount of orders coming in down here. And if we lock it into a profile, we can see exactly what those orders are. And it looks like the majority of them came out at 3.5, which, hey, guess what? What a shock. I wonder where 3.5 is. Oh, it's almost like it's right underneath the lows. So all the volume stacking up, and now we're seeing another big chunk of volume. So we're seeing buyers coming in. Whether they're sellers taking profit or buyers coming in below the lows, it doesn't really matter. It's a range, and buyers are going to be coming in down here, assumably looking for a bounce back up. Always keep an eye on the near term and see if you can line up the near term with the long term. Then you've got your big 1-2 punch. That's where you get the really, really nice trades. But that's going to do it for today. So like we always say, stay safe out there. Keep those stops in play. Let the winners run. Hopefully you had a fantastic day of trading. And until the next one, we'll see you all then. Thanks.